Our last panel, we're very happy and thrilled to be able to welcome both our director of the Latin American, Latino and Caribbean Center, Dr. Marianne Mahoney in the History Department, and also a visiting scholar or a local regional scholar from the University of Connecticut in political science, Dr. Charles Venator Santiago. And they are going to take us into a different context, more on the historical and political context of health in the Americas, or politics and things in the Americas. Thank you.
Thank you, Catherine. Thank you, Andrew. And thank you, everybody, for spending most of your, if not your entire day here, either online. It's been a lot of, it's been really, really interesting. I've watched both in person and partially online with my students at 140, and it's been really great. What I want to do today is talk about some research that I did about 15 years ago. Oh, right. Thank you. Thank you. Anyway, the title of this talk is Inequality and Influenza in 1918 Brazil, and I created a subtitle called A View from the Countryside. One of the things that we know about Brazilian history is that the vast majority of it deals with a few parts of Brazil, despite the fact that the country is the size, is larger than the continental United States, right, without Hawaii and Alaska. And the image on the left here is the image of the train station in Itabuna in the state of Bahia, which I'll show you where that is shortly, in 1913, shortly after it opened. It was the height of modernity in the area at the time, with the exception of the three-story elevator that had just been introduced into a hotel in the port city of Ilhéus. On the right is the image of what Itabuna, downtown Itabuna, about where the train station is, looks like today. We're going to see some images of Itabuna even before 1913. So just a little bit of geography here. Right here is a map of the states of Brazil, and the one that we are talking about, oops, sorry about that. The one we are talking about is there in orange on the right. It's called Bahia. It means bay. It is a state in northeastern Brazil. It is the size of France. Okay, so when we start talking about Brazilian history, we're talking about the majority of the population of South America and the majority of the space of South America as well. It has a number of regions. The Recôncavo, which includes the state capital of Salvador, which was Brazil's original colonial capital. It has backlands, western highlands, and the area that I work on was in 1800 a significant area of Atlantic forest. It's along that southern Bahian coast, and here is where Itabuna is, the red. Let me get to some of the prepared text here. On October 24th, 1918, as spring was coming to the small Brazilian city of Itabuna on the emerging cacao-producing frontier, domestic servant Maria Baudelina de Jesus died of influenza, known as gripe in common local parlance. She was the first person in Itabuna, as far as we know, to do so. 6 months later, on April 11th, 1919, as fall was well underway, and let's not forget, right, the southern hemisphere, so fall and spring are opposed. as summer was coming to a close, 44-year-old indigent, quote, unquote, crazy Julia so-and-so, 44 years old, indigent, about whom nothing further was known, died in a shed in front of the train station. That image that we saw at the beginning. Between the two events, another 115 people died of influenza. Another 2 died of fever, undescribed. 31 died of an unspecified sickness, doença, and another 15 had no cause of death listed. This all was in addition to the quote-unquote normal causes of death. That's my quotations. In other words, birth defects, firearms, gastroenteritis, and tuberculosis, among others. The numbers don't seem very large, especially when compared to the overall numbers of the epidemic of influenza around the world, or in comparison to COVID-19. And although in Itabuna at the time, the gripe was the most important cause of death, and I should say that the numbers, those 22 people who died in October 1918, died between October 27th and October 31st. So it's 4 days. Yeah, 27, 4 days, right? And then the 65 people who died, that was almost the only thing that anyone died from in November of 1918. In Itabuna at the time, gripe was the most important cause of death, but in the state capital, and I just want to go forward a couple, right? In the state capital that year, malaria and TB were much more important as causes of death. And the following year, right, there was a smallpox epidemic which simply drowned out influenza as a cause of death. So I want to talk about gripe, in part because the documentation that I have shows what must have been quite a traumatic 6 weeks in this small town, but also because the material that we have gives us some clues about what might have been going on in the countryside. It's right. Gripe was not the largest cause of death in the state as a whole or in the nation as a whole. But when we consider that this rural, agricultural, and commercial town of Itabuna was at the edges of an expanding agricultural frontier, and that the epidemic came and left very rapidly between late October and essentially Christmas Eve, and we look at who actually died rather than just the statistics, we're able to examine in close detail some of the inequality for which Brazil was already becoming famous. Scholars have written extensively about the 1918-1919 influenza epidemic, although less about it in Brazil, and I'm not a scholar of the history of medicine. But they've shown that globalization brought this virulent version of influenza to Brazilian ports, as seamen who staffed the ships that arrived from the United States and Europe, particularly England, to pick up Brazil's famed coffee, sugar, cacao, rubber, and deliver European and American manufactured goods, brought it with them. We know that the disease moved inland and north from Rio de Janeiro and Santos, Brazil's most important ports, first, but it did so by sea, not by internal methods of communication, from what it seems. By January 1919, it had died down, and by April 1919, it seems to have been gone. But late October, November, and December of 1918 were difficult. My goal with this paper is to rescue some of the deceased from the obscurity of statistics, to paraphrase E.P. Thompson. While they're no longer here to provide interviews, the death records, combined with documents on the broader social history of the region, allow us to explore their lives, their deaths, and the loved ones that they left behind. That may be a little ambitious given what I was actually finally able to do, but that was the goal of where we were going. Let me just say a little bit about the records themselves. From the 1600s through the beginning of the Brazilian Republic in 1889, only the Catholic Church kept records on births, marriages, and deaths of Brazilians as part of the ecclesiastical responsibility. But beginning in 1889, with the fall of the Brazilian monarchy and the declaration of the Republic, civil registration of births, deaths, and marriages was instituted. This occurred only 2 years after the abolition of slavery, but at that time, Brazilian governments also began to keep such records. This was done locally, town by town, in local notary offices and courthouses, and that's where those documents generally continue to stay. I came across the documents used to create this graph quite by accident in the courthouse in Itabuna as two graduate students, now college faculty, and I were looking for documentation on rural labor, and particularly Indigenous and Afro-descended labor and landholding. And we were not looking for data on the gripe, but it just happened, even though they weren't supposed to. After the declaration of the Republic, officials were not supposed to record either color or race in the record. That was supposed to be obscured. And there were two reasons for this. One was that social reformers in politics were very concerned that slave owners would try to go, right? Slavery had ended in Brazil in 1888, and there was a concern on the part of pro-abolition forces, right, that that powerful elites would somehow manage to recapture their people if they could find them in the record by looking up status or connections, right? And so they weren't supposed to record color or anything of that sort. And there was a myth for a very long time in Brazil that there was no documentation on captives or enslavement or anything like that because it was all burned. A very specific collection of documents was burned, but there's enormous amounts of paperwork that's still in Brazil. More about that on a different occasion. But we lucked out and found that this notary public in Itabuna in the first 3 decades of the 20th century started writing things down that he wasn't supposed to, for which we can thank him. Anyway, a bit about Brazil, the state of Bahia and the law. Let me talk about a little bit what the data shows first. So we've seen just the raw number, and I don't think the raw number fully tells the story. I think it's that rapid increase and decrease that's really pretty extraordinary. And it reminded me of the first few days of the pandemic when nobody really knew what was going on, and all of a sudden, But if we take a look at this, right, which are the numbers of deaths by age from gripe, the single most vulnerable population was the population under age 5. And these are just deaths from the flu. There's another vulnerable population over the age of 40, but given that life expectancy was so low, probably only about 40 or 45 years old among the poor, maybe even less than right. And you can also see a certain uptick in the economically, well, I should say that the population of 6 to 9, that's where the economically active population of the poor begins. Right. So these are not all poor people who have died, but you shouldn't assume that just because somebody's 9, they're not working. The next point that I want to show is this, right? Brazil is famous as being, and Bahia, the state of Bahia particularly, is of being the place in the world with the largest population of people of African descent outside of Nigeria. But what does this show in terms of deaths? It shows a category of the color, which is a feminine word in Brazil, a cor parda, which is often thought to be mixed race, or mixed black and white, being perhaps a synonym for mulatto or mestizo. And you can see in the national census data that the terms get moved around. And one of the things that's very difficult about tracing some things in Brazilian history is that the categories for color and race change. And right now in Brazil, there's something, the last time anybody did a real research on this, there were about 95 different terms for race and color, right? And it depends on if you're, to some extent, trying to insult someone or like cultivate them or, right? I think we also ought to take a look here at where it says unlisted. So there were more people whose color was not listed than there were people who were either white or black in the death records. And what we have come to the conclusion about a number of us working on issues that deal with some of these things is that this tends to be reflected when the registrant, when the official taking down the documents, right, gets confused. That it's a middle-class person or a well-to-do person who comes in and is obviously, as we say in Brazil, where money whitens, socially white, but that doesn't necessarily, but no one wants to insult the person, so the color is left blank. Oh, seriously, I mean, like in 30% of the cases, the color is blank. You're like, okay, yeah, how do we explain this? Well, So, why wasn't more attention paid to this in general? And I want to say this both from the position of scholars of Brazil, but also at the time. The governor of Brazil in his 1920 report to the legislature says, influenza was fairly bland here. Lots and lots of people got it, but not very many people died. I find that a really interesting way of explaining 386 people who died in about 2 months in 1918. But if we take a look at the number of people who died from TB, for example, or malaria, right, those numbers are much higher. Yeah? And if we take a look at 1919, 2,800 people died from smallpox. 2 centuries, well, no, a century and change after the first vaccinated people arrived in Brazil, and this was after the vaccine revolt in Rio. So it may be understandable that influenza, especially since it hit in the summertime, not in the wintertime, and people were outside more, may not have attracted as much attention as it did elsewhere. And I think, for those of us interested in the comparative health policy, I think this small amount of data indicates that the most important disease eradication policies are not the same in every place in every time period, because clearly malaria, thankfully, right, there's a vaccine now, right, and TB and then smallpox were horrific. But anyway, so Bahian economy and society in general, it's most famous for sugar and African enslavement since 1534. It's got the largest population of African descent in the world outside of Nigeria today, but it also has significant export economies of diamonds, tobacco, and cacao. But cacao emerged in the late 18th century in Bahia and pushed south and west into territory still occupied by thousands, if not millions, of indigenous people. And new research on indigenous people in Bahia is suggesting that in the area that the death records that I have come from, Parda refers to indigenous people who have left the forest and moved into agricultural society. That doesn't mean that's all that's in that category, but that's so. I also want to point out that there's been a real indigenous political reemergence in Brazil, and particularly in Bahia, among other things, among the Pataxó people. And here is an image of what happened when the Brazilian government in 2000 and the Portuguese government tried to put together a 500-year commemoration of the arrival of the Portuguese in Brazil. Yeah, indigenous people from all over Brazil showed up and made a stink. And this is right down. This is about a 5-hour bus ride over bad roads from the area that we're talking about. So if we think about where indigenous people are today, I mean, Bahia is out there on the on the east side, and even though, right, if you watch the news media in the United States, you would think there's like Rio de Janeiro, maybe Sao Paulo, and then the Amazon. There's actually a lot, there are indigenous people today all throughout Brazil, in much the same, it's a very similar situation to that in Connecticut. In many ways, they've been integrated into the broader society, but we have to assume that Brazil, like Connecticut, like the United States, is a nation built on cemeteries. So by the time that influenza hits, right, cacao growing and cacao harvesting had become the most important driver of the local economy. And from the late 18th century, this required both a clearing of indigenous people out of this coastal area of Brazil, and here we see, right, reference to 18th century slave raids against indigenous people. But we know in 1818, when Prince Maximilian Weed von Nieuwweed traveled through southern Bahia, he ran into lots of different indigenous groups, including, and painted them, including this Botocudo family. Botocudo simply means plugs, and they're the indigenous people of Brazil who have ear and nose plugs. This was labeled as a Pataxó or Camacá family in 1818 Bahia, right? One of the indigenous people of the Americas' greatest gifts to humanity, of course, is the hammock, yes, for which we are eternally grateful. But in 1816, this village, which is basically located where Itabuna is today, was an indigenous mission. And it's not that there were no longer any indigenous people in the countryside resisting, because there were, but we have lots of evidence of indigenous people settling at least part-time in missions, becoming sedentary, and it's quite likely Brazilian historians of the area who work on indigenous people believe that actually indigenous people in the area became hunter-gatherers as a response to attacks from the Portuguese and or Brazilian settlers, and they weren't necessarily hunter-gatherers who then became, right, that we need to upend that general assumption. Here again are some images from 1860 that both show, with perhaps one exception, a collection of people who might turn up in the documents in the 20th century as Pardo. And the two gentlemen on the right-hand side are clearly labeled, if you can read it. This was done by Joseph Seleny, an Austrian naval artist who traveled with Prince Maximilian of Habsburg, him famous for becoming, right, the Emperor of Mexico and getting shot. He was in Bahia first, and people claim that that's where he got syphilis, but, anyway. You can see there's a significant population that's brown. And if we come back here to the images of indigenous people living in the forest, one of the key elements here is that the two gentlemen on the right-hand side are clearly wearing Western-style clothing as opposed to the way they had been living. So cacao moves across southern Bahia. This is the interior of a cacao grove. They're great, wonderful places to walk in if you ever get a chance. And by 1910, this is what Itabuna looked like. So here again is the train station in 1913. Here is the train station in Mutuns, which is an agricultural village further south. And so I'd like to suggest that as the cacao economy moves into the interior, as the trains move, that also influenza is moving, and it is coming at the population that is vulnerable. And it's interesting, I didn't get a chance to do the chart for you, but about a third to a half of the people who died were listed as indigent, right? So Maria Julia Gitao, right? The crazy Julia so-and-so who dies in the shed at the train station is not unusual. In fact, she's emblematic of the general problem. But I don't want to suggest that right, all brown people and all black people in this area were poor, because this is an area that did allow for some social mobility. Firmino Alves, right, being the founder of the formal place of Itabuna, and Henrique Alves dos Reis, the illegitimate son of an enslaved woman, becomes the mayor in 1913, right? But what's key about some of these gentlemen is that they are very much tied into the globally expanding international capitalist economy, right? They don't see themselves as having a lot in common with people who theoretically look like themselves. And I'd like you to recall that this is what Alves looked like with a suit and tie on after he became a merchant. When he was a muleteer, right, and a cacao harvester, I'm sure he was sunburned and not clean and wearing different clothing. And in Brazil, that has significant cultural connotations. But anyway, what I just to take us back to where we started, I'd like to suggest that Brazilian historians in general, as we know, have really underestimated the number of indigenous people and their descendants who survive in Brazilian society, and that if we are lucky and look at some of these data, we can see both some of their experiences and that in 1918 and also in 2021, because COVID is going, for lack of a better word, ballistic in Brazil, where the president doesn't apparently believe that it really exists. Yeah. That in fact, we are unfortunately seeing some significant continuities between the past and the present. Thank you. Yeah. Sorry, Charles. Did I? Oh, there you go. Here's that. Can we clean that? Let me get my. Thank you.
All right. I'm going to put my timer here.
Yeah, I realize my,
Okay. Well, first of all, thank you. This is my first actual live conference outside of my little bubble with my 8-year-old. I spent about a year hanging out with him mostly and talking to him and talking to screens. So it's kind of cool to be here. Oh, 1 second. Let me make sure that I don't put my 6-hour timer. So let me give you a little bit of a context before I begin talking or explaining what I want to do here. Several years ago, Edwin Melendez, a former director of El Centro, set this task to figure out how we can create the conditions to deal with the problem of independence in Puerto Rico. And the first task was to figure out the citizenship thing. Nobody wants to give up their citizenship should Puerto Rico become independent. We finally solved that problem. Now we're tackling the question of the economy. And the economy of Puerto Rico is essentially a $76 billion economy with $30 billion budget a year, 20 of which are based on parity on social service funding. Yet we have upwards of anywhere between 42 to 60% of the population living in poverty, even though $20 billion a year come on dedicated to dealing with questions of public health, housing, etc. We are right now in the middle of a series of debates around expanding parity fund or talking about parity funding as a way to deal with the crisis that Maria created. So right now in Congress and the courts, there are conversations that could lead up to an additional $10 billion a year in Medicaid funding and other forms, and supplemental Social Security income and other forms of funding. So this talk, or what I want to share with you today, are some of the underlying debates that I think we need to pay attention to. And I say that because one of the underlying challenges that I have is trying to have a conversation that separates debates of federalism from colonialism, separates conceptual debates from legal debates, and explains the legal debates in a more political approach. And I say this in a friendly tone because part of my challenge is trying to combat the misinformation that some of my colleagues reproduce. So before I begin there, to clarify that argument, let me give you a couple concepts that I find useful in understanding the case of Puerto Rico. The first, I use a post-colonial notion. And by post-colonial, I don't mean the South Asian approach or theoretical approach. But in 1898, what you had were two traditions of U.S. expansionism. Colonialism, which was premised on the acquisition of territories to make new states. And again, 37 sufficient territory was acquired to make 37 new states after the original 13. And imperialism, which is premised on the idea of acquiring states for strategic, economic, or military purposes. And these were clearly defined traditions in the Supreme Court, in Congress, and in other foreign policy initiatives. And then comes the problem of Puerto Rico, the Philippines, and Guam, and the United States invents a new tradition that is premised on the acquisition of territories without slating them to become states, without creating a path to statehood. This is the first time the United States annexes a territory but rejects or refuses to put that territory in a path to statehood. Hence the post-colonial, the idea of going beyond colonialism. The second problem that always confuses a lot of scholars is this, what I've described now as a Hegelian antinomy, or a contradiction in territorial policy. The Supreme Court issues rulings, in this case, that declare Puerto Rico to be a foreign country for constitutional purposes, and Congress passes legislation that treats Puerto Rico as something else, in many instances like a state of the United States. So the question then becomes, who has the power to decide what happens in Puerto Rico? And the Constitution is confusing enough that it allows us to allow both to claim that power. The Supreme Court claims that power through judicial review of the right to interpret the Constitution, and the Congress acquires or gives itself that power through the Territories Clause, which enumerates a power to interpret the Constitution for territories. So you have these contradictions going on, and they've been coexisting for the past 120 years. In addition to that, what you see with U.S. policy is the idea of inclusive exclusion. And again, here, this is I got this from a conversation in a photocopying room with philosopher Adi Ophir, who was trying to explain to me the similarities between Palestinians and Puerto Ricos, where they are politically excluded but socially included. Well, in the case of Puerto Rico, when you look at federal legislation, Puerto Ricans sometimes are treated as a part of the United States, but simultaneously excluded from equal membership in the United States. So when we think about U.S. policy, you have to think about this simultaneous inclusion for some things and exclusion for other things. And then finally, the question of the doctrine of separate and unequal is really important. The United States Congress, the executive, and the president made a clear decision not to apply the Plessy v. Ferguson's doctrine of separate but equal, because separate but equal still guaranteed a degree of equality. What we have is a new legal status that allows the Supreme Court and Congress and the president to treat Puerto Rico unequally. And that's the basis of the status of Puerto Rico today. Nothing has changed. Okay. The second point that I want to clarify quickly is that the United States invents this logic, the new logic which we describe as the doctrine of separate and unequal, between 1898 and 1901. In 1898, the United States acquires Puerto Rico under the terms of the Treaty of Paris, and for the first time declares that the residents there are not meant to become citizens, and invents a new category, the Puerto Rican national. And essentially treats Puerto Rico as a foreign territorial possession. The military invents a new tradition called the Dependency status, modeled after the British dependency government, and essentially writes all the blueprints that the Congress would adopt in the Foraker Act. And it's interesting because if you read the early reports, the military is very clear, particularly General Davis, to say, listen, everything that we asked for, Congress and the court gave us. So the model that we have today for the status of Puerto Rico is based on the writings of essentially General George W. Davis, George B. Davis in Puerto Rico. And then the insular cases, which are the law of the land today, essentially grab or interpret the Foraker Act and establish that Puerto Rico is an unincorporated territory. That is a territory that is not meant to become a state, and it's a territory that can be ruled as a foreign country for domestic or constitutional purposes. Nothing has changed since 1901 in terms of the status. In fact, Congress recently reaffirmed that principle after Maria, or in the midst of Maria, with Promesa and other legislation. Okay. I want to briefly touch on the case of Balzac because as we're heading to the centennial of this case, it's really important to understand what it means. Balzac is, in some ways, the last of the insular cases. It's a case around the question of whether the Sixth Amendment should apply to Puerto Rico. And the court holds that it does not apply to Puerto Rico. In other words, the right to trial by jury is not a constitutionally guaranteed right in Puerto Rico today because of Balzac. But Balzac's key contribution, in my opinion, is to apply the doctrine of territorial incorporation to a territory inhabited by citizens who had been collectively naturalized after the Jones Act of 1917. And the two principles that I want to sort of hinge on this or emphasize are that Balzac establishes that the status of Puerto Rico will only change once Puerto Rico or once Congress enacts express legislation incorporating Puerto Rico. And Congress has refused to do that for more than a century. And then the second issue, which is really important, is that the court concludes that what determines the application of the Constitution is not the citizenship status of Puerto Ricans. Puerto Ricans have the same citizenship as anybody else, but rather the status of a locality. That means that when any U.S. citizen travels to Puerto Rico, they lose rights. When they come from Puerto Rico, they gain rights. So the application of the Constitution is going to be contingent not on citizenship, but on the status of the territory. Locality determines how the Constitution applies, and that opens the door for different types of discrimination, which I'll explain in a minute. So the idea is that the unequal status of Puerto Rico is going to be determined by the status of the territory, not by the status of its inhabitants. And again, Congress has refused to enact legislation incorporating Puerto Rico, even though Congress for social services funding in a large number of bills treats Puerto Rico as a state. In other cases, it treats it like a foreign country, and in other cases as something lesser. Okay, so what's the problem of parity funding? Most funding is received through block grants. And when I say parity funding for social funding, we're talking about equal funding on social services that include supplemental Social Security income, Social Security, Medicaid, Medicare, and a host of other social network or social safety sort of funding that can address the needs of people living in poverty in Puerto Rico and can address the needs of people living in an island that is locked from the rest of the world for economic purposes and from U.S. markets in some instances. So what we have is that some federal aid is not extended to Puerto Rico. For example, if you retire and you live in poverty and you want to claim supplemental Social Security income, you will not receive that if you move to Puerto Rico. You can move to Korea, you can move to Moscow, you can move to Brazil or Ecuador or Cuba and still receive a supplemental Social Security income check. But if you go to Puerto Rico, you lose that right. If Puerto Rico were included in the supplemental Social Security income, a family that earns $5,000 to $7,000 a year, or a person that earns something like $5,000 a year, who receives about $56 a year, would now receive upwards of $800 a year in supplemental Social Security income. And that's a debate that's happening right now. If parity funding were granted for nutrition assistance, like SNAP, the amount of money and resources that would arrive in Puerto Rico would grow exponentially. And I'll say more about this in a little bit. Third problem that emerges is that the Puerto Rican government, in many instances, has opted to receive different funding than what is available to citizens in the United States because it has more control over how that funding is allocated. So when Puerto Rico was given an opportunity to become part of the supplemental Social Security income, the Puerto Rican government chose to remain under the Aid for the Aged and Blind and Disabled, which again gave the Puerto Rican government a lot more control over who received funding, but again limited the amount of money that would arrive to Puerto Rico. In other words, somebody who receives funding through the Aid for Aged, Blind, and Disabled would receive an average of $56 to $60 a month, whereas under SSI, the average person would receive anywhere from $700 to $800 a month. And again, when you're talking about questions of poverty, that gap on that program alone is incredible. And something like that is happening with Medicaid and Medicare in the island also. And then the other problem is that rates of reimbursement. Puerto Rico has a bankrupt economy, but the federal government treats Puerto Rico like a part of the United States and expects Puerto Rico to essentially reimburse the federal government at the same rate in order to receive other types of reimbursement. Okay. So that's a little bit of the context. At present, the debate is whether Puerto Rico should receive parity funding in Social Security, Medicaid, health programs, and a few other programs which could, again, when you total the amount of money, could add up to anywhere from $5 to $10 billion a year in additional funding to address questions of poverty in Puerto Rico. So the current baseline right now that's under debate was established by a case known as Harris versus Santiago Rosario in 1980. This is the current logic that informs how the court thinks about this problem. It informs how Congress thinks about this problem. It defines the contours of what's possible and what's not for federal funding. And the argument is really simple. Puerto Rican residents do not contribute to the federal treasury. And by the way, I'm quoting from the opinion. These are direct quotes from Justice Rehnquist. This is not my language, which is not true, because the Puerto Rican government contributes more to the federal treasury than 5 states combined, just alone on the amount of people. There are upwards of 3 million people living in Puerto Rico. You have many states here that have less than 1 million people living. So when you combine the contributions, that argument falls apart. The cost of treating Puerto Rico would be high. Well, sure. The cost of treating Puerto Rico, like I say, would be high, but that hasn't stopped federal governments from granting support or aid to people living in poverty, especially because people living in poverty don't pay taxes by definition. They can't afford to pay taxes. And then greater benefits could disrupt the Puerto Rican economy. And again, this case had to deal with aid to families with dependent children. And the argument there is that if the federal government gave more money to people living in poverty, it would destroy the local economy. This is the current baseline that the Supreme Court uses and Congress uses to figure out what federal funding goes to Puerto Rico or not in areas of health and other social services. Okay, so there are at least 3 challenges going on right now. In the Supreme Court, or making its way to the Supreme Court, are 3 cases around supplemental Social Security income and Medicaid reimbursement. These are the Peña Martinez case, a case from Guam, and the Baello Madero case. And in the Baello Madero case, we're going to see a hearing in the Supreme Court in, I want to say it's November 9, but I'm blank. It's sometime in November. In the Baello Madero, Judge Helpia, a local judge that's been considered for the First Circuit Court of Appeals, and we'll see what happens there, argues that discriminating against Puerto Rico in the application of, in this case, supplemental Social Security income violates the equal protection rights under the Fifth Amendment. And the argument here is that since Puerto Ricans are equal citizens, to discriminate economically would be a violation of their equal protection rights under the Fifth Amendment. And he wants to make a case that this is an example of racial discrimination that has been embraced by Congress and the federal government more generally. Judge Helpi's argument rests on the interpretation that Puerto Rico has been incorporated because most constitutional rights have been extended or applied in Puerto Rico since 1898. In other words, because the Supreme Court has issued a number of rulings that essentially apply piece by piece parts of the Constitution, he wants to argue that the status of the island has changed. Therefore, the logic of the insular cases should no longer be relevant. The logic that Puerto Rico is a foreign country for constitutional purposes should no longer apply, and therefore the Fifth Amendment should apply equally in Puerto Rico as it would apply in the United States. And again, this is an effort by a local judge to use his power in a district court to issue a ruling that could challenge the insular cases. And that debate is also taking place in Congress, although the government of American Samoa and the Mariana Islands are resisting the idea of declaring the insular cases unconstitutional, even though they're the ones who are treated the worst under that tradition. But I can return to that in a second. Okay, it seems to me that there are 3 ongoing legal, political responses that I think we need to pay attention to. And the key, in my opinion, was issued in a recent ruling in the First Circuit Court of Appeals on the case of the Asociación Hospital del Maestro, which is a local association of hospitals, versus the Secretary of Health, on hospital reimbursement for low-income patients under the Medicare program. And the court's response was really simple. When you look at the language of the legislation, there is no evidence that the legislation includes racist language that would purposely discriminate against Puerto Ricans. Now, the question is, well, what about these constitutional precedents that define, in the first place, the premise that it is okay to discriminate against Puerto Ricans? But since Judge Torruella died, the Puerto Rican judge that was pushing these debates in the First Circuit Court of Appeals, the court is now reverting to this logic that nothing is happening here. There is no racism. There is no discrimination happening. It's just Congress didn't use the proper language, or Congress hasn't applied a particular legislation to Puerto Rico. In the case in this hospital, the court concluded that because because Puerto Rico did not receive Social Security income, the formula to calculate hospital reimbursements would be different for Puerto Rico than it would in a state. So we have this sort of circular logic that is essentially enabling the federal government to not provide parity funding or equal funding for citizens who live in Puerto Rico. And then, of course, the second argument is that there's no unlawful or unconstitutional discrimination in Puerto Rico because there is no intent to discriminate in the first place. Okay, so that's I think the basic logic that we're going to see in Congress and the Supreme Court in the upcoming month. Notwithstanding that legal debate, Congress is debating increasing federal funding for Puerto Rico. The Connecticut delegation is committed to providing parity funding as a way to find a backdoor to deal with the local corruption and mismanagement of funds by providing individual funding to people in need in Puerto Rico. Part of the problem, again, is that since Maria, we've seen an increase in poverty, an exponential increase in poverty in Puerto Rico. And again, parity funding or social services funding is a business that generates between $20 to $30 billion a year in Puerto Rico. But again, the question is who manages the disbursement of that money? And then, of course, the Supreme Court is waiting to hear this case by Biomatter in November. I think it's November 9, if I remember correctly, but don't quote me on that one. To conclude here, part of what I'm interested in is to make sure that we understand that there's a constitutional, constitutional language that defines what is possible and what is not possible. And until Congress and the Supreme Court decide to deal with those constitutional premises, it's not clear to me that we're going to see parity funding or that we're going to see Congress enacting legislation that's going to address questions of poverty in Puerto Rico through a social safety network. And right now, Puerto Rico, again, we're talking about a population that needs financial support because it's been essentially locked out of international markets, locked out of some federal markets, and essentially living in an island with, I don't want to use the term closed borders, but fairly secure borders that make it difficult for Puerto Ricans to engage in the sort of migratory exchanges that you would see normally in a state of the United States. In the United States, if somebody wants to go do business in another state or engage in some sort of mobility, it's a lot easier to just get in a car, bus, or train and move. In Puerto Rico, it's a little bit more complicated because of the nature of the island. And anyway, those are the debates that are happening, and I hope we can keep track of them. Thank you.
We have some time for questions and comments for the two speakers or anything else from the day. Since you're up there, what's going to happen on November 9th? How is the court?
So is there anybody familiar with the Biomatter case? No. So under current law, if you live in Puerto Rico, you don't get access to supplemental Social Security income. And as I mentioned before, under the Puerto Rican program, you would receive the equivalent of anywhere from $50 to $60 a month, whereas with SSI, you receive anywhere from $700 to $800 a month. In the case of Biomatter, you had essentially someone who worked in New York all his life, moved to Puerto Rico, but kept his bank account in New York. So he was receiving SSI in New York, but moved to Puerto Rico and was withdrawing money from SSI, from his bank account in New York. So for SSI, for the Department of Social Security, the assumption was that he was a resident of New York, not a resident of Puerto Rico. Anyway, 10 years later, they find out, and they want to charge him back. They want him to pay back 10 years of SSI. Again, if you're receiving SSI, you can't. It's almost impossible. So Judge Helpi issued a ruling saying by demanding that he pay back his money and by depriving Puerto Ricans of SSI or residents of Puerto Rico of SSI, you're violating his Fifth Amendment rights to equal protection because if he's receiving them in New York, he should be able to receive them in Puerto Rico as a citizen. Nothing has changed in his status. That case created a lot of controversy, but it's the easiest one to resolve because he broke the law. The Peña Martinez case, which is an homologous case, says it's discriminatory to withhold federal funding in Medicaid and SSI and other programs to any U.S. citizen living in Puerto Rico because their citizenship status hasn't changed. It's only their residence, and Puerto Rico is still within the United States. Now, what sort of Helpi and a few others pro-statehood advocates are trying to do is force the Supreme Court to issue a ruling declaring the insular cases, the status of Puerto Rico, unconstitutional because it violates the Fifth Amendment, equal protection. In other words, by declaring that the Fifth Amendment applies in Puerto Rico, they would have to reject the Balzac ruling, the ruling that says it's the status that determines the application of rights. They're trying to force, on one hand, the court to make the decision. The second issue that they're trying to do is they're trying to force the court to tell Congress to provide parity funding for Puerto Rico. My guess is that the court is going to say, that's all political problems. You have to resolve that in Congress. We have no role in shaping the power of Congress to rule over territories under the Territories Clause. Now, the question then becomes, well, what if the court decides to play politics and challenge Nancy Pelosi and the Democrats to address this issue? And the court could turn around and say, listen, there is a violation, and Congress is now on the hook for X amount of money, which could add up to about $5 billion, $5.3 billion is what they're talking about. And Democrats would now have to deal with this question. The flip side of that could be that a majority conservative court may turn around and say, listen, we don't need to spend money in SSI. We don't need to do social safety spending. So it's up in the air. My personal guess is that the court is going to say this is not our problem. However, in saying that, it shifts the responsibility to Congress, and Congress will finally have to decide what they're going to do about it. And this is one of those environments where there's a lot of money floating around. Congress has said that they're thinking about increasing Medicaid for reimbursement for Puerto Rico to 75% as opposed to 50%. And given that the Puerto Rican economy or government is bankrupt, that might make a big difference. I think at the end of the day, Congress is just going to raise some reimbursement for Puerto Rico, which should be helpful in the area of public health, particularly Medicaid and SSI. But it's, I wish I had a good one to predict. But what's at stake is really trying to force the Supreme Court to do something about unequal funding. And the last point I'll say about this, what is really worrisome for me is that this is a $20 billion industry. The United States contributes to Latin America anywhere, from $2 to $3 billion a year. And we still have 50% of the population in Puerto Rico living in poverty, even though they're receiving $20 billion a year in subsidies to address questions of poverty. So I'm not sure the fix is in Congress necessarily or the Supreme Court. We still have to deal with this privatization of social services, which is draining what's going on, draining that amount of money that should be going to people living in poverty in Puerto Rico. I don't know if that. I'm sorry? No. So Baello Madero, again, it's this question of this individual who breaks the law. And in Peña Martinez, you have a group of progressive lawyers and attorneys and social and activists who are saying, listen, denying elderly access to SSI, SNAP, and other Medicaid and other social services is a violation of their constitutional rights as citizens of the United States. They make a much stronger case, but the courts refuse to take that case because I think they would have to deal with the question of inequality. I think the court chose the Baello Madero because it's an easy case to get rid of, and they can say they're doing something about the question of poverty. Part of the challenge is that Congress doesn't just want to give money to the Puerto Rican government because they're not sure that the money's going to be spent. Again, we're talking about a $20 billion a year industry that doesn't help, or at least not enough. So my guess is that Baello Madero is an easy test case that can either force Congress to do something and can get the court off the hook from having to issue a ruling on the unequal status of Puerto Rico.
But the court being, we know it's a 60-feet conservative court, but was this type of case treatment
Yeah. No. The majority, 4 out of the 9 judges are interested in this case. But the conservatives basically have 6 votes in the Supreme Court right now. And Roberts, who usually swings back and forth, has indicated that he doesn't support social services. So this also opens the door to start chipping away at the idea that the federal government should support, in this case, SSI, because there is a push to get rid of social safety network. And this is, again, one of those test cases. The flip side is everybody recognizes that not enough money has been sent to Puerto Rico to deal with the crisis created by Maria and the 2007 crisis. So this is one of those cases that allows for that negotiation to happen.
So in the beginning of your talk, you mentioned that you and a group at El Centro, right, were working on issues related to independence, and that you had, that you had figured out the citizenship issue, and I wondered if you could share with all of us what that might be, because I've had a couple of conversations with people in which it's like, people in independent countries aren't automatically citizens of the United States.
So let me say 2 things about that. The first is the antinomy, the contradiction. For Supreme Court purposes, Puerto Rico is a foreign country for constitutional purposes. Being born in Puerto Rico for the Supreme Court means being born in Italy or France, because it's a foreign in a domestic sense. Congress, on the other hand, has Congress has debated upwards of 100 laws, citizenship laws, and enacted upwards of 10 laws that provide different types of citizenship status to Puerto Rico. Began first with Puerto Rican citizenship, then it began to allow for the individual naturalization of Puerto Ricans through a 1906 law that allowed people to essentially go to a district court and naturalize and waive their residence status. The part of the problem with Puerto Ricans naturalizing is that Puerto Rico was, for international purposes, was part of the United States. So in order to naturalize, you had to declare or renounce your allegiance to a sovereign nation in order to undergo the naturalization process. So Puerto Ricans were caught in this trap because they couldn't renounce their allegiance to the United States in order to naturalize. That's fixed in 1906 with a special waiver. Puerto Rican women, however, were able to acquire U.S. citizenship through marriage or the doctrine of coverture since 1899. The next phase that comes is in 1917 when Congress collectively naturalizes Puerto Ricans, but it doesn't change the territorial status of Puerto Rico. So on March 4, 1917, anyone born in Puerto Rico is still born outside of the United States. So they can't acquire citizenship automatically unless their fathers are U.S. citizens. So you start seeing a series of individuals who can acquire citizenship even though they're born in Puerto Rico between 1917 and 1940. And that included women who divorced or widowed, lost their citizenship and became stateless in Puerto Rico. It included the children of aliens. I mean, it just included a range of people. So between 1917 and 1940, Congress tries to fix this with 3 corrective acts. But again, unless you're born in the United States, you don't acquire citizenship. You can only acquire it through a derivative form of citizenship. And then in 1940, Congress decides to fix it by declaring that the 14th Amendment applies to Puerto Rico. So since 1940, birth in Puerto Rico for Congress means birth in the United States. And then they fix it with a couple other laws that protect Puerto Ricans from being denaturalized. Puerto Ricans who were living in Latin America at the time, before 1940, if they lived longer than 5 years, they lost their citizenship automatically, like any other naturalized citizen. So this 1940 law and the 1948 law begin to rectify that problem by conferring a native-born status. The question is, does Congress have the power to enact that legislation, or does the Supreme Court remain supreme in the interpretation of the Constitution? I argued that no, Congress has an enumerated power to solve this problem. So we went through the legislative history of Congress to figure out what is the language, what is the source of the legislation, and Congress is clear. It's 1940, it's the 14th Amendment, and it borrows from the Virgin Islands case. Now in July 2021, the Supreme Court in the United States versus Fitisemano said the Supreme Court is not going to determine whether the citizenship of the 14th Amendment applies or citizenship applies to a territory or not. That's the role of Congress. So in doing that, at least the 10th Circuit Court of Appeals essentially cedes the power of determining citizenship to Congress, particularly birthright citizenship. And that changes all the debates. So when we look at the legislative history, we know that the 14th Amendment is the source of citizenship, and now at least one federal court has said, well, it's up to Congress to make this decision. For those of you who are not familiar, Fitisemano is a group of American Samoans who are asking the courts to declare that the 14th Amendment applies in American Samoa. But the courts have refused. They said, that's not our role, that's Congress's role in the area of citizenship. But this explains that argument.
Okay, thank you.
All right, any other questions? Thank you for enduring. Thank you for being with us.
Thank you, everyone. Oops. Thanks, everyone, for coming and for everyone who spent the day. Thank you to our guests who came from quarantine and from another part of the United States. We're very grateful that you blessed us with your presence. And again, I want to thank the organizing committee, Sylvia Halil Gutierrez, Catherine Sugg, and Reynaldo Rojas, and Millie Guzman Young, and our inimitable students who, right, Isabelle de Souza is out there right now, I can see, yeah. And Andrew Peñaranda was, but they are part of the reason that, there they are, that any of this exists. So thank you, one and all, and thanks for coming, and good night. Good afternoon, something.